Now, live from Whitney Media, 1460 WVOX, The Greenberg Report, with Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner. You can join in the conversation at 914-636-0110. Now on 1460 WVOX, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenberg Town Supervisor. And today we're not going to talk about current politics. We're going to talk about American history, about the Civil War with Irvington High School teacher Christopher Barry, who recently wrote a book. His first book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War. And thank you, Chris, for joining us. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a U.S. history teacher at Irvington High School. I've been teaching for 31 years, the past 21 at Irvington. I have a lovely wife and two beautiful daughters, and I live in Mamaroneck. I also coach track and cross country at Irvington.
That's great. And have you always been interested in history? And what got you interested in history?
I think I have. My parents early on sort of raised me to be interested in history. I grew up on Long Island, and as a kid I visited a lot of historical houses. Took a trip to Sturbridge, took a trip to Gettysburg, actually, as a probably 10 or 12-year-old. So, yeah, I'd say pretty early on I got interested in history.
What made you interested in the Civil War? There's a lot of people, for some reason, who are just fascinated by the Civil War more than many other aspects of American history.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first of all, I think it's one of, if not the crucial moment in American history. That in and of itself makes it interesting. For me personally, growing up in my house, we had a commission paper for my great-great-grandfather, who was an Irish immigrant who fought in the war. And it was hanging in our family room, and I always had a curiosity about it, as did my family. When we went to Gettysburg, we wondered about where he was in the battle, whether he fought, etc. And coming back from there, I always kind of had that curiosity. And when I was lucky enough to get a teaching job in the Washington, D.C. area, I took a trip to the National Archives in the early 90s and found out a lot about my relative. And from then on, that's when I pretty much was hooked.
That is great. Now, you wrote a book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War. And why did you write that book? And why did you focus on New York and that 65th?
Sure. The 65th was my great-great-grandfather, Lieutenant Timothy Carroll's unit. When I took that trip to the National Archives, I learned from his pension files and his military record that the regiment had been in most of the major battles in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War, so that piqued my interest. As I got better at researching and delved into the official records of the war, got to see some memoirs and some diaries, I learned pretty early on that there was no history of the 65th New York, and I just read and visited all the battlefields that they fought at. And as I learned more and more about it, I realized, it was a miss that there was no story of their particular role. So over time, I gradually realized maybe I'm the person to do that. So I finally took the plunge about 8 years ago and started writing the history.
How long? So it took you about 8 years to write the book?
Yeah, as a teacher and a coach, it was hard to do much during the school year. I'd use breaks and here and there, but mostly in the summers, I would spend time writing and usually traveling to the places I was writing about, which I like to do because it helps. But mostly over the summer, I would put it together.
Have you connected with other families who had relatives in the Civil War?
Yeah, to some extent. More generally, I've connected with a lot of people interested in the Civil War. As you said, there's many people who take an interest in it, luckily for me. So I've had battlefield tours, and I've had an opportunity to go places that are not always open to the public because of connections with people who are either interested in a battle or maybe interested in a particular unit. So, yes.
As a teacher, were your students involved in helping you with the research?
To some extent, yes. In fact, I'm lucky enough at Irvington to teach a senior elective, actually open to everybody now. Some sophomores are in there this year, on the Civil War, and I've been doing that for 15 or 18 years probably. And they helped me with the book title, actually.
Great. We have to take a break. I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes or less. Thanks. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and we're talking with Chris Barry about his book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War. How do they get the book?
It's available on Amazon. You can Google No Flinching from Fire, and it pops right up.
Great. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenburgh Town Supervisor.
Now, back to the Greenburgh Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenburgh Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
Hi, I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and my guest is Christopher Barry. He's a Westchester resident, and he's a history teacher at the Irvington School District, and he's been teaching for 21 years at Irvington High School. And the students are lucky because they have a teacher who is really passionate about history. And he wrote a book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War. And we were talking before about Irvington, students. Do you find that many of the students also have a passion about history?
Yeah, I do. I'm very lucky with the gig I have there. I get to teach 3 sections of Advanced Placement U.S. History. So students, I think, are in there partly because they are just innately interested in American history. And years ago, my former principal allowed me to start an elective on the Civil War, which I mentioned before. And happily, every year I've had enough students sign up for that I've been able to keep doing that. And certainly teaching seniors who are in a class they choose to be in a class that focuses just on the Civil War for the whole semester, you're going to get kids that are fired up, which is great for me. Obviously, it makes me lucky.
And it's also nice because you have a connection to the Civil War because your family participated in the Civil War. Does that make it more interesting for students?
I hope so. I wonder if my students would say they've heard more than enough about the 65th over the last few years. But as I said before the break, when I told them I was working on this book and I had a working title, which originally was There was no flinching from fire, which was from a battlefield report about their first action, my Civil War students themselves said, no, that's not good. Make it just No Flinching from Fire. So they actually helped me make the title, and I agree with them. It's much better as it is.
Has being a teacher helped you write a book? Once I tried writing a book, and I lasted a couple hours. It's tough.
Yeah, well, I think being a teacher has helped. Certainly, having the summer time to focus. It does take a lot of time and focus, but I do think reading a lot as I do, and I think some of my students do as well, helps me think about in writing, what I'm looking to do. But again, I have to say, certainly having the time in the summer to focus on the writing. I started really thinking I was just going to write an article, and it just became chapter 1, and then went from there over many years.
Could you tell us a little bit about some of the interesting chapters in your book?
Sure. Well, the men from the 65th headed down to D.C. in the early fall of 1861, so they were there fairly early on. They saw their first action in the Peninsula Campaign. I sometimes think and I tell my students, my great-great-grandfather is a good indicator of how the war went for them. He fought in the Peninsula Campaign. They were at Fredericksburg. They were at Chancellorsville. They were at Gettysburg. And he emerged unscathed for those 2 years, really. And then when Ulysses S. Grant took over and they went on the Overland Campaign, featuring the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, that was the beginning of a process where my great-great-grandfather was wounded 3 times. Certainly at the Wilderness, they were on the far right flank of the line. They got attacked at the end of the day and surprised. And their brigade commander was actually captured. A bunch of the regiment was captured, and many of them, or several of them, actually died as prisoners at Andersonville, which is a horrible prison down in southwest Georgia. So the Wilderness was really bad. At Spotsylvania, they were in on a key attack called Upton's Assault. which was also very bloody. They lost 97 of their men at Spotsylvania over a couple weeks. So they were in some really bloody places. They also were in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864 with Phil Sheridan at a place called Cedar Creek at 3rd Winchester, and lost very heavily there too. So they're at some key spots.
When you were doing, the research, and I guess initially you were motivated to research your own relative, how do you how do you get the information about a relative? And they didn't have Google then.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Yeah, when I started in the 90s, it literally started, like I said, going to the National Archives and filling out a form on paper and asking them. I had learned that if you had the relatives, and this is true for any war, by the way, any veteran, if you have their unit, it helps a lot. And at the National Archives, even in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, they have information on veterans. They have a military record or a military file, and they have a pension file. In the military file, you find out everything you can find out about their ranks, when they were appointed to higher ranks, where they fought, when they were paid, etc. The pension file is really the gold mine, though, because when I opened the pension file for Timothy Carroll, I found letters from his wife, my great-great-grandmother, asking for a pension, talking about their children. She was taking in laundry in Manhattan, very poor. There are affidavits from relatives talking about their marriage. And there's also doctor's reports. I got the marriage certificate. I got the death certificate. So there's a lot in there, particularly in the pension file.
That is so fascinating. It must be really exciting finding information about a relative.
Yeah, it really opened up a whole world for me. And when you're, I'm pretty sure I was probably the first one to look at that pension file since it was filed back in the 80s or 90s. So yeah, there's a certain thrill about discovering things, and certainly found in the process of writing the book, both about the parts about my relative, but also about the regiment as a whole. Part of the fun is working through and writing, and that's a slog, but it's rewarding as you work through it. But also discovering new memoirs, discovering diaries, traveling to these archives and finding out more and more, flipping through newspapers with correspondence from members of the regiment and the actual newspapers from 1863. For example, up in Providence, Rhode Island.
What was the newspaper?
It was the Providence Evening Press. I got a tip from another historian. I was reading a book about 3rd Winchester, and he said he had a letter in a footnote referenced about the 65th, and I asked him if I could see the letter, and he said that Providence newspapers are a treasure trove because some soldiers from the 65th New York actually were recruited up there. So I went up there, went to the library, and actually got to flip through newspapers and found about 30 articles about the regiment, which is obviously a great source.
Is that newspaper still around?
I don't think the Evening Press is. The Journal is, Providence Journal, and that's another one that I found a bunch of letters from.
Right. We have to take another break, and when we resume, we'll be interviewing Christopher Barry, history teacher at Irvington High School. He's taught for 21 years, and he wrote a book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War, and that book is available on...
It's on Amazon. Again, No Flinching from Fire, and it's Prime eligible, so you can get it in your house in 2 days.
Great. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor.
With world and national...
1460 WVOX.
Now, back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
My name is Paul Feiner, and my guest is Christopher Barry, and he's an Irvington High School teacher, and he's been teaching for 21 years at Irvington High School. Irvington must be very fortunate because they have a teacher who has a real passion for history. He teaches history, and he also is teaching students about his great-great-grandfather who was part of the Civil War. And I don't know a lot of people who could tell stories about their great-great-grandfathers.
Oh, thanks. And the more I learned about it, the longer the stories got, I'm afraid, as I know my colleagues and my students would say.
Did your parents talk about the Civil War and the role of their great-grandfather?
My dad sadly has passed away, but he traveled with me on one of my first trips. I won a grant to follow the route of the 65th in the mid '90s from my last school, and he and I drove together through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and to Petersburg, and that was certainly a lifetime memory. My mother actually works as a docent at the Huntington Historical Society, so she's still interested. My dad was a big World War II buff. His brother was killed in the war, and he seemingly always had a World War II movie on or a World War II book. But he got excited to help me when I got into it, and my mom has certainly been an enthusiastic supporter and happy to say likes the book.
Sort of interesting because you were talking about World War II and Greenberg. We have living history tapes. We've interviewed during the past 10 years about 150 World War II veterans, and we have about half-hour interviews of each of the veterans. And every Memorial Day and Veterans Day, we replay the tapes. And now we're doing a living history initiative for the 9/11 survivors or people who were first responders. And we're starting a living history initiative for people who were involved in the Civil War. And I was sort of thinking when I was interviewing you, or preparing for the interview, wouldn't it have been great if we had videotapes of your great grandfather who could have talked about his role and shared it with future generations?
Yeah, absolutely. What's one of the things I say probably a lot in class is if we could bring him back, or if we could bring this historical figure back, what would we ask them? What would they say? It's fun to be able to think about that. Luckily, through projects like the one you just mentioned, we're able to more and more have really good primary source stuff that we're going to have forever now to remember these stories. Certainly going back to the Civil War, it's a little trickier, but as I said before, we have memoirs, we have letters, we have diaries, and as you piece those together, it is possible to put together part of the story. I still don't know if my great-great-grandfather could even write. I don't have any of his letters. I don't have a photo. That would certainly be a great discovery for me. But certainly, at least I know I've read enough from people that were with him that connection, for me at least, is there.
So you're a proud grandson.
Yes, very much so.
Were you able to find out anything about his personality? And do you feel no?
No, I don't have anything on him particularly. All I really have is what he looked like from the military records, and even those vary a little bit because you'll see different references. But basically, he was 5'8", 140-ish pounds, gray eyes, light brown hair.
Was there any resemblance with you?
Well, maybe a few years ago, maybe I was 140 pounds, but not for a while, unfortunately.
Right. In terms of your students, how do you get them excited? And
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, I'm lucky, first of all, to have a great group of students at Irvington. I think every teacher has their own style and approach, and there's many ways to do it. For me, I've always felt like history should be told sort of as a story. And though I may often go on tangents or tell stories that may not be particularly crucial for whatever lesson we're doing that day, I like to think it maybe certainly lightens it up and perhaps makes it more interesting. But I think my big push is for students to understand that history is not, a bunch of events and people that you need to memorize. It's a story that unfolds. It's constantly changing. And the more perspectives we have and the more different ways we look at it, the more we learn about it and the better it is. That
is great. Now, you mentioned that you're going to be talking to residents in Irvington next week.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm happy and lucky to be able to do a talk about the book a week from Sunday on February 9th at 2 o'clock at the Irvington Public Library. It's sponsored by the Historical Society in Irvington and the library there. I did a talk while I was doing my research several years ago for the library and the Historical Society. So I'm really happy and, as I said, lucky to be able to come back and do it again.
And you're doing another one in the Sound Shore area?
Yes, I live in Mamaroneck, and March 8th at the Mamaroneck Library at 2 p.m. I'm also doing a talk, and that one's going to be personally fun for me because I wrote most of the book in the library. So it's just a cool thought to be able to come back and read from it and talk about it, knowing all the hours I spend in that library. mostly, as I said, in the summers working on it.
I know, with town supervisors, there's a town supervisors association, and we meet every month and we talk about town issues. Is there like a history teachers association where history teachers get together periodically and just talk about?
Yes. There's a Lower Hudson Council for the Social Studies, which I've been lucky enough to be a member of. They have a conference, for example, every year in December. I didn't go this year, but I've gone many times. I used to be a department chair for 17 years at Irvington, so that was something I really took seriously and helped me a lot, especially as I was a new teacher in New York coming from out of state. And in fact, I'm lucky enough to have the daughter of the current president of that association in one of my APUS classes, who's a stellar student.
Could you like promote the book among the other teachers? Is there how do you get people to actually buy a book? You spend 8 years writing a book and it takes so much time.
Yeah.
And then how do you publicize it and promote it?
Yeah, good question. I haven't really done it through teachers, although I will say not through teachers beyond Irvington. My colleagues at Irvington have been amazingly supportive. They really blew me away with their willingness to purchase the book, first of all, and hand over the $20 I'm asking for the book. One colleague actually took a picture of me. We take an annual field trip to Gettysburg, and she took a picture of me at the monument to the 65th New York, which is on the back cover of the book. And she was happy to share it with me and gave me permission to use it.
That's great.
But they've also been just really supportive, just buying the book and talking about it. And I'm very lucky to work with such a wonderful staff. They're colleagues, but they're also friends.
I was mentioning during the break that if I was you, I would contact some college teachers, and then you could charge $500 for the book because most college professors, they write a book and then they make the students buy it.
Yes, it would be nice to be able to get that much per book, but as I said, I'm real happy with how well it's done to this point, given that I published it myself, and given that, as you said, that the promotion part is kind of all on me. I've used social media. I started a blog. My friends on Facebook know I spend a lot of time, even before the book was done, I spent a lot of time sharing pictures of the trips I took and some of the memoirs or excerpts of sources I found. So a lot of them, I think, have been following the journey, for years as I write.
That is great. You were talking before about the fact that you took a tour of the areas that your great grandfather was involved in. And could you tell us a little bit about the locations that you visited?
Sure. My wife has been very patient with me, as most summers over the last 10 years or so, I've traveled, especially to Virginia, because that's where most of the fighting was for them. Probably the most interesting, I guess, trips I took is with two of my colleagues and best friends from Irvington. In 2014, I walked the actual marching route, or as close as we could get to it on the modern roads, from Manchester, Maryland to Gettysburg. So the 6th Corps, of which the 65th was a part, did this epic 36-mile march to get to Gettysburg on the second day, and I decided to reenact that. You asked earlier about my reenacting interest. I never put on a uniform. I had a T-shirt and shorts, but I did walk that route. And then 2 years ago, the same two gentlemen, my former principal and a guy I coach with, Scott Mosenthal, and my fellow coach, Jim Buckley, were crazy enough to join me again, and we walked 36 or so miles from Barnesville, Maryland to Antietam to Sharpsburg, again, following the route of the 65th. So I've done a lot of driving through battlefields and walked the battlefields, but probably those long walks along the march routes were the more interesting ones.
And is the terrain much different?
It depends. Sometimes you go through shopping malls, unfortunately, but yeah, when you get to rural Maryland or rural Virginia, certainly there's still parts that the roads might be paved, but they're the actual roads. So you can get pretty close, and there's still a lot of farms out there, and get a feel for what it might have been like.
We have to take one more break, and my guest is Christopher Barry. And his book, No Flinching from Fire, the 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War, can be purchased on Amazon. And he's going to be doing a reading at the Irvington Library.
Right, on February 9th, a week from Sunday at 2 p.m.
At 2 p.m. And if you love the Civil War, love reading about the Civil War, you might want to take a look at his book. I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor. We'll be back with one more break.
Now, back to the Greenberg Report on 1460 WVOX. Once again, here's Greenberg Town Supervisor Paul Feiner.
I'm Paul Feiner, Greenberg Town Supervisor, and my guest is Christopher Barry, Irvington teacher at Irvington High School. And I was saying to people that Irvington is so lucky to have a teacher who really has a passion for history. I remember when I was in high school, I remember the history teachers that I had. And if somebody really loved history, it just comes alive and it can make a difference for their entire life.
Yeah, I certainly remember Mr. Snyder, Mr. Bear, teachers who got fired up about it. And I think that's true, obviously, in any subject. And happily, luckily, at Irvington, we have plenty of teachers like that. But certainly, it makes a difference when you know the person in front of you is excited and interested in what they're teaching about.
Yeah, it was interesting. Last week, my guest was Kasem Enza, whose son happened to win the Nobel Prize, and she credited a teacher at Sleepy Hollow High School as inspiring him. And you never know how you're going to touch somebody.
Yeah. As teachers, I think really we have a huge responsibility in that regard. Certainly, there's plenty of students, I'm sure, that haven't been quite as fired up by my teaching or my classes, but we always need to remember what impact we potentially have, and certainly what we say and how we say it. All of us who've gone through school know, just as you said, that the influence that our best teachers have is lifelong.
I just remember I do a lot of biking, and I was bicycling on West Clinton, and I think there's somebody who was a Secretary of State who lived in Irvington. Are there a lot of, did Irvington play any role in the Civil War, Irvington people?
Much more so in the Revolutionary War era. My colleague, Dr. Eric Weisselberg, could tell you about that. He's very much in the local history. The one thing I can say, or the one vignette I can tell in terms of Civil War in Irvington is Abraham Lincoln's funeral train did go right through town, and the Tarrytown Argus, I believe, was the newspaper, has a story about the hundreds of people coming down the hill to pay tribute to the train as it went through. His train on the way, actually, to D.C., becoming president, also went through Irvington along the Hudson line.
And I went to the program, I think at Phillipsburg Manor, on the slavery, and I was surprised that a lot of people in Irvington weren't as liberal as they are now.
Yes, indeed. We forget. That's one of the big things I try to work with my students is we had slavery in New York quite late. I think my students are sick of me saying, please never write in an essay, the North was against slavery and the South was for slavery. We had slavery very late in New York State into the 1820s, I believe, and certainly, locally, slaves basically, any of us who've been to Phillipsburg Manor know that slaves basically ran that place.
Have you, reached out to Historic Hudson about your book, or maybe even thought about doing a lecture there, because they're trying to promote history as it and put a little local touch on it?
Yeah, I haven't spoken to them particularly, although Eric, my colleague who I just mentioned, was on the board of the Irvington Historical Society. My friend Scott, our former principal, also is on the board. So it's been more local with Irvington to this point. As I said, teaching and coaching keeps me busy, certainly, but the shameless self-promotion comes on the side. But certainly next summer, as I'll be writing less, but promoting more, these are the times I have to probably start making the connections.
Are you planning to write any other books?
Yeah, I actually have a couple thoughts. I guess I have a retirement plan when I'm finally ready to go. The next book I want to write, I've actually already started it, is more about, it's really the book that my two friends who walked with me kept telling me I should write, which is more about my own interests and my own experiences. So For example, I'll write a chapter about our walk to Antietam and what it meant, and try to interweave my own experience of, following the steps of my great-great-grandfather with the history of the 65th there. So a little bit more, I guess, accessible, and also maybe more personal, and certainly not as long as the first one.
Or an interesting book would be if there's probably a lot of people who might have relatives who were involved in different wars, and maybe they want to research their great grandfathers or grandmothers, and how do you go about doing it? Because like I would have like no clue where to start.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there is a lot of information online about that. And again, the National Archives is the place I would go to first. The Library of Congress to some extent also, but the National Archives is your best bet. If you have a relative who is a veteran, as I said, of any American war, they have a record. And the military record is there. And if you're lucky, there's a pension record as well, if they applied for a pension or if their spouse or children applied for a pension. That's the place to start in terms of the personal stuff. And there's a lot of information, certainly, in terms of the units, the military units that you can access either online or through books.
That is, that is, great. In terms of, what would you recommend to students who may want to write books or go into history?
Another really good question, Paul. I think follow your interest, number one, and work hard on making sure that you've researched it well. If you're talking about writing history, you need to get as many sources as possible, as many perspectives as possible. It's not enough just to read books, for example, about the Civil War written by others. You really need to get into the letters, into the official records of the war, the reports, the battle reports, the letters of generals and leaders. As I said earlier, the newspapers of the time. So much stuff now is online. It's digitized even. It's indexed. So I often say I don't know how historians did it before the internet. It was much easier for me. I have traveled to a lot of different archives and repositories of stuff, but many letters I found online, or I got sent from libraries having seen references to them online. But I'd say get into the primary source material. That would be my first thing, and work hard on it.
When the title of your book is "No Flinching from Fire: The 65th New York Volunteers in the Civil War," was there a draft, or did they all volunteer?
Very good question. They volunteered. They were early. They, as I said, I think earlier, they came down to D.C. in September of 1861. So there was a draft later in the war, beginning in 1863, and certainly some replacements as they lost more and more casualties and even more men to disease. Some replacements were draftees. More of them were volunteers, though.
That is that is interesting. When you went to like the archives, did the research librarians also help you? And while you were doing the research, would you chat with another person doing research, and did they give you tips? Is that part of getting
very
a book
much so. They're very helpful, and I think sometimes the life of an archivist or librarian can be a little bit mundane. They're so skilled in researching, and I tell my students when they're doing the research paper for my APUSH class, use the librarians because that's what they know how to do, and that's what they're excited about and passionate about. And you don't even know what you don't know until you tap into somebody like that. I remember when I found a letter from a newspaper correspondent in Providence, and I literally exclaimed, "Oh my gosh," or something like that. And the archivist there said, "We're always very happy when our customers, our clients exclaim publicly." But it was so exciting for me to find it. And it wouldn't have been possible were it not for people like that who can sort of show you which way to look and also helpful hints as to save time doing it as well.
And there was also diaries from Syracuse University.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go up there twice. There was an 1864 diary by a gentleman named Frederick Volk, who was a captain. I just recently found his gravesite actually in New Jersey over the last break. And he wrote a diary for the whole 1864. He was wounded at Spotsylvania, so part of his diary was about recovering in New York City. But he made it back by the end of the war. But his was a great source for the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania.
Did you get much help from your wife and kids in writing the book?
I did, especially my wife helped me with some editing. She's a very good writer in her own right. We met actually. She used to copy edit my memos at the office we worked at together. My youngest daughter in particular, Rachel, is a history buff, and she really has taken a lot of trips with me and helped. Diana, as I told you off before, as I told you about it off the interview, she's a talented artist. She actually designed the cover for me and helped me with the layout. So she's less interested in the history part, but she's very talented and helpful. And Rachel actually conceived a trip to Arlington National Cemetery where we found the graves of about a dozen members of the regiment. She's happy to tag along, and a couple of her photos are actually in the book as well.
That is great. So we just have a couple, maybe a minute left or so. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
I would just say thanks to you, first of all, Paul, for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks to my colleagues and my friends who have already bought the book. One of the, I guess, surprising things about this whole process is you work really hard for a long time and you come up with a product, and that part is rewarding. But as I said earlier, my friends and colleagues at Irvington High School and outside, and former students and current students and parents who've been excited and contacted me and got the book and talked about it with me, it's really rewarding. It just makes me feel good, and I'm so lucky to be at a place where people appreciate the effort.
Yeah, and if anybody is thinking about moving to Westchester and you're looking for a real good school district, you might want to consider Irvington because they have great teachers like you.
Thank you so much.
So,
it was a great place to be.
Great. So I'm Paul Feiner. I'm the Greenburgh Town Supervisor, and I'll see everybody next week.